Hi, this is International Master David Pruess, and today we're going to be doing a lesson that's very dear to my heart. And it's going to be, I believe, my first lesson about the King's Gambit. And people have often asked me what's my favorite opening. That's a really tough question for me personally because there are a whole array of openings which are dear to my heart. But if I had to pick one, I sometimes managed to pick the King's Gambit as being perhaps my favorite playground within the world of chess. So consequently, I've planned to open chess.com's new university with a course on the King's Gambit, and sort of as a preview, as a taste of what that course could entail, decided to record a couple accompanying video lessons to give you a sense of what's going to happen there. So in that course, I will teach a bunch of King's Gambit principles, but then also we'll spend a lot of time sort of looking at practical positions from the King's Gambit and trying to figure out how to apply principles. So today, I'm not going to teach you any principles. I'm going to do the application part already, and hopefully you'll know to some extent the principles that we talk about or be able to figure them out as we go. So without further ado, let's launch into a couple examples. I've got two planned for this first lecture here. They're going to be here in the King's Gambit Declined. D6 is a modest version of the King's Gambit Declined, simply defending this pawn here solidly, but you'll notice blocking this bishop in, so it's not the most aggressive for black. So knight f3 is normal. Note that here black could transpose to the King's Gambit accepted if they took on f4, but my opponent played knight c6. And now here is the first point where I'd like to stop and ask you what move you think you should do for white here. You have a couple options. Think of your options first without deciding which one you want to do, and then press play again, and you can hear me list your options. So your options are principally to develop this bishop, to move this pawn so that you stop sacrificing your f-pawn by defending it with your bishop, or possibly to play knight c3, which is another decent developing move. So what do you think here? What move is attractive to you? All right, so the way you would answer this question is a mix of calculation and application of principle. Okay, so in principle, what I would tend to prefer in this position here would be to develop this bishop. But in the King's Gambit, normally you put the bishop on c4. Here you have two choices which might be of interest to you: bishop c4 or bishop to b5. Those are both nice diagonals for the bishop. In one case, it puts pressure on the knight and thus on the e5 square. In the other case, it's obviously on a nice open diagonal towards f7, which is a weak square here. So both of those moves are possible. Then there's the possibility of moving the d pawn. Well, on principle, d3 is not an exciting enough move because it locks in our bishop. Okay, that's not really thrilling, so it's not our first choice. You could play it if other moves weren't working out well for you, and I'm not saying it's terrible, it's playable, but it's not your favorite move. Your next option is d4. But here, white is playing very, very, very aggressively to put so many pawns into the central pawn tension, and you need to carefully consider what you would do if black tried to fight you for control of the center by developing his bishop, where it attacks your knight. And I think that the result is actually that this, if you calculate a little bit, you'll feel that the result here does not seem amazing for black. Probably push your pawn and face knight to d4. Alternatively, you can play bishop to b5, then black's going to take on f3, and now you're going to lose a pawn, right? Because if you go here, I don't know about lose a pawn, but you lose a pawn if you take with your queen, and if you take with this pawn, you have some issues with your king position. which I would find unpleasant personally, right? And if queen here, I was thinking that black could take like this. So d4 seems like an overplay, a little bit risky against bishop g4. So the important question is, where should we develop our bishop? We can develop it to 2 squares where it has a good impact, and then we can decide whether to play a more modest d3 or a more aggressive d4, and we can decide whether or not to castle, etc. On principle, I'm not concerned about black taking on f4, so I'm not in a rush to defend that pawn. Okay? I mean, we offered this pawn on move 2, and we haven't yet had any changes in position which suggest that we can no longer offer a pawn sacrifice. So it comes down to bishop c4, bishop c5, or bishop b5, and it turns out bishop b5 is almost always strongest in these positions because the pressure on e5 is so good, and the possibilities in some case of destroying black's pawn structure by taking on c6 are significant as well. Finally, you will actually usually follow up with d3 as opposed to d4, and when you do, you'll have a nice light square pawn structure, right? And that means that having your bishop traded off on c6 will be fine because your pawns will cover your light squares. So bishop b5 is very strong in these positions usually, and my opponent played, and black plays bishop to g4 in this case here. So he's sort of fighting with white over the same e5 square with the same technique of threatening, or of taking the knight out of play, because white doesn't want to lose their queen. Now, let me just get rid of those lines for you for a second. So the question is now what does white do next in this situation here? Well, interestingly, white's going to spend a tempo here to play h3 just to force the trade which black indicated they were willing to make. What's the reason for that? Well, the reason for that is, consider the very likely pawn structure that could arise like this. Right, white's pawn's like this, black at some point playing f6. If each light square bishop traded for a knight, who would that favor? Well, it would favor white because white's remaining bishop is not blocked by his pawns, and black's remaining bishop is blocked by black's pawns, right? And white has light squared pawns which defend the light squares, which are now weak for both players who lack light squared bishops, and black's pawns do not defend those squares. So the difference between the value of white's bishop and the value of black's bishop is so great that white can afford to spend a tempo here on h3 just to force that trade. And by the way, I really do mean force, because if the bishop goes back, then g4, and the bishop is trapped. So black's only other option is to do something like playing bishop back to d7, which is playable, right? But then at least white doesn't have to worry about that bishop taking his knight on f3, and white can start thinking of ways to try and win the fight for the square e5. So white puts the question to the bishop, black just trades off, white takes back, and now black played an interesting move taking on f4. This is interesting because here white has the bishop pair. So often the way you would play this is when someone has the bishop pair, a lot of people think that the person with the bishop pair wants the position to be open. But that is a principle which is really not specific enough to be all that helpful, actually. So here's the thing that black has to consider. Actually, white might be very happy to create a stable pawn structure like this, because the stable pawn structure leaves black weak on light squares, which is the color of square of the bishop that black is missing. And white is now not going to trade his knight on c6 probably, but at some point put it on this weak diagonal that I showed you from b3 to f7. So black could actually be afraid of landing in a stable pawn structure here, because it's one where his light squares are weak and white has really good play. So instead, what black does is they try and mess up the position by taking on f4. Mess up as in, stir things up, create a more chaotic position, one where white won't be able to settle down and exploit the light squares over time. So it's a very interesting decision from black, but quite likely a good one under these circumstances, according to my understanding of King's Gambit play. So here's an interesting moment for white as well. This is a part of the game where white did not look far enough ahead, shall we say. White has a choice between castling, playing d3, playing d4, playing knight c3, a whole bunch of moves, and white just kind of played the glib d4. But I want to let you all know that d4 gaining the most space in the center is not necessarily automatic. There are many positions where you'd be happy to play the more modest move d3, keep a solid structure, try to recapture your pawn, and this structure here keeps black from fighting back on the light squares at all, because white really keeps control of them with this light squared pawn structure, with the queen on a light square. So d3 could certainly have been considered, and this is a position where white definitely just played an automatic move quickly. It's also quite possible to castle, right, hurrying up your development and your possible threats on the f-file, and delaying the decision about the d-pawn. Finally, white could perfectly well grab the pawn on f4 with the queen, right, just making sure that you get back your gambit pawn, and then preparing to castle. But if white plays d4 in this position, it actually needs to be a concrete move, because positionally it's not so obvious. If white plays d4, it has to be some concrete ideas based on the knight on c6 and the bishop opposite the king. White has to have ideas of either playing d5 or maybe playing e5, opening the queen. But as it turned out, white had no particular idea in mind. They played d4, g5, and then just castled, leaving this pawn hanging out here on d4. And black has a very good answer here, and I'll ask you to find that in a moment. So let's go back and suggest what a better approach for white should be here. Why don't you stop your videos and try and think about it for a moment, and then come back to me and we'll discuss it together. Okay, so I would suggest that white actually just castle and delay that decision for a moment about which way to move the pawn. Now, let's say black plays the move g5, like they played in the game. Okay, in that case, I think that white should not play d4 transposing into the game, because the square here is weak. Okay, in this case, white has two possibilities. They can play either knight to c3 or g3. So they could play g3. So obviously black's not going to take the pawn because of this move, right? And white's idea is they win back their pawn and they open the f-file. And this should lead to pretty interesting play, but it does make you wonder why white didn't grab the pawn before, right? Like if you're white and you were in this position here, and you were considering queen takes f4 or castling, and then you thought, oh, I will castle, and then on g5 I will play g3. You have to ask yourself, how much sense does that make? Why am I trying to trade my g-pawn for black's g-pawn when I'm castling kingside if I could have just taken on f4 with my queen before? So this approach, like just looking at it, it looks plausible, but at the same time, if you just do a little bit of comparative thinking, which is really important in the opening, it doesn't make much sense. Okay, so instead, after g5, perhaps white should just continue developing, and black will develop as well with bishop g7. And we're just going to continue developing very modestly for white, knight to g6. Sorry, knight to e7, headed to g6 at some point. And queen h5 to try and harass this pawn and create some play for white. And I think black achieves a plausible position here. So another approach that white could have used, which employs the move d4, which he played in the game, is to have played knight to c3 now, preventing black's idea in the game. Let's get back to that in 1 second after we see what black does in the game. So white castles. Can anyone figure out a good move for black in this position here? I'm going to assume that those who wanted to have paused their clocks, and I'm going to go ahead, have paused their movies. Sorry. I'm used to clocks when I talk about chess. All right, black challenges this bishop right away, and this is excellent because at the moment white's pawn on d4 is hanging. So black can force white to make a pretty critical decision here. In the game, white plays bishop to a4, black plays b5, and black takes the pawn on d4. But let's say white takes on c6. Does white have any special advantage in this position? Well, it's a really complicated position. I would think that white would probably try and win back their pawn on f4 right away, and we would get sort of a complicated game. White's king is going to be weak, but white's pieces will be more active, and white might have a bit of an advantage. But still, I think this was a good reaction from black, that perhaps white could have tried to prevent previously. So now that we know what black's idea is, how should white have played here? Well, this is the move that I find interesting, knight to c3. The idea comes from the Botvinnik variation of the semi-Slav. And the idea is that when black plays b5 to try and win control of this square, white just sacrifices the knight and wins back a piece right here. Doesn't it look exactly like the Botvinnik, those of you who know that opening? It's kind of funny how it does, right? So anyway, this looks like a plausible variation for white, and then something like this will happen, and you get a weird game, just like in the Botvinnik. So that would have been an option for white if they wanted to, if they had foreseen the idea of a6 and b5 for black. Which unfortunately for them, I guess, they weren't really paying attention while they played. So let's go on with the game. White castles, black plays excellent a6 and b5, and then grabs the pawn. So now white is in a world of trouble because they've lost a center pawn for nothing, essentially. So we're gonna do this last part very quickly, but because it goes a little bit aside from our main point, but I want to show you this anyway because it's really instructive and it comes from this game, and that is how people can scramble to stay in the game when things don't entirely go their way. And in our King's Gambit studies, we'll see a lot of scrambling or creative thinking, right? Trying to come up with something when things aren't going exactly your way. That's going to be an important skill to have, and we will be looking at a lot of games of players from a rating range of 1,300 to 1,800, and there will be a lot of, back and forth missed opportunities. And so it'll be important that even when, you notice that something didn't go your way and that you've lost a pawn, that you still scramble for your chances. So what should white do here? Where should they move their queen? Well, the answer is they can harass black a little bit by going to h5. The queen gets in contact with two poorly defended pawns, and that is going to cause black a little bit of annoyance. First, to get rid of the f7 threat, they trade the bishop. And that means that now the pawn on a6 is undefended, and a little bit of a target for white, potentially, right? And now, if black wants to develop their knight to f6, they need to defend the pawn on g5. So correctly, they play h6. White develops. The idea, of course, the knight could come to d5, or it could take on b5 in some case if the rook weren't defended by the queen. So black develops, and white seems to be forced back with their queen, but even though it's a retreat, it has some sneaky possibilities. One possibility is to play e5, right? Opening the queen on the rook on a8. And then there will be possibilities of queen c6 check or knight takes b5, right? For example, I'll just move black's bishop here, knight takes b5. You see he can't take back because of rook a8. Okay, of course that's not incredible for white because black would just ignore it and castle. But white's other possibility is to play queen c6 check also, drive the knight back, and now play knight takes b5. And now this pawn is hanging, and this pawn is hanging. So this is a little bit more serious by white. Okay, and there's a second idea, which is what white plays in the game. So this queen is on a pretty good square. Black plays bishop g7, just developing calmly, and now it's white's move. And white needs to choose between their two ideas, e5 or g3. Which move would you play? Are you thinking? I want you guys to think. It's not all up to me to feed you. Okay, let's have a look at the moves. Let's say white plays g3. Black's possibilities include castling or taking. So let's say they castle, and white takes, black takes, and white takes back. So white is still down one pawn. How do you like their position? So if you would say that it seems like a plausible position, like not great for white, not terrible for them, then I would agree with you. I think that white has some compensation for the pawn, but certainly no advantage. Let's say white plays e5 instead. So it attacks the knight, which limits black's options pretty considerably. The knight doesn't even have a good square to go to. Right, so we're going to imagine black takes the pawn. We're going to play queen c6 check. Black's going to block with their knight in order to be able to castle. Now we'd really love to keep black from castling, but it seems we can't prevent it. So we take a pawn while we can. Black castles. And now what do you think of white's position? Don't take like this because of rook to c8. Okay. So you can't win every single pawn here. You need to do something a little bit more modest than that. Probably take this pawn, right? So then black will play rook a6. Notice that the tricky tactic, knight to b8, probably fails to white taking your rook. Right, so don't get that knight in the way. So he takes, and now, this position here needs to be evaluated as well. Do you like it better or worse than the position you got from g3? Hopefully you like it worse, because see here the black king is very secure with millions of pawns around him, and black's again up a pawn. They've got a variety of moves here, and I'm not going to say like which move is the best for sure. I mean, e4 opening the bishop is plausible. Moving the knight somewhere to open the queen is plausible. You could go to c5 or b6. But just if we wanted to stop and evaluate, this feels pretty good for black, right? Because white's rook and bishop are badly placed against black's strong set of pawns. Okay, so in the game, white plays g3. And now black should have castled, but black took on g3. Kind of a greedy move, right? They didn't want to give back the pawn. Right, the variation where I castled, black gave back one of two pawns. Then white was only down one pawn, and they had some compensation. So seeing that, black thought that wasn't good enough. They knew white had really messed up by hanging the d pawn, so they hoped for more. So they play greedily. They take on g3. What's wrong with this? What's wrong with it is just a tactic. Right, white threatens the knight on f6, and if the knight on f6 moves, white has checkmate. And this is why you need to be very, very alert to seize your chances when playing the King's Gambit, okay? Because if you're going to be in a position like this, 2 pawns down, and you don't notice the knight to d5 idea, why, then you are unlikely to play g3, right? Because there's no way this is going to thrill you. And if you don't play g3, well then you're really in a pretty bad position. So g3 takes knight to d5, and black has no way to save or defend the knight, so they simply castled, and the game traded off into this endgame, which of course we're not going to analyze. You can see this endgame, white has a bishop against 3 pawns. It's a slight advantage for white, and it was still a very tough endgame, which white or black could have won or drawn etc. Any result could have happened. Okay, so that is our first example, and since as usual I've droned on fairly long, I'm going to take a quick pause here and put the next example into the next video. All right, hope you enjoyed that, and hope you'll enjoy the next one too. See you next time.